European history, the United Nations Organization, Union 1945-1917. The United Nations Organization, Union 1945-1917. The United Nations Organization, UNO, was an international organization that was established on 24th October 1945 at San Francisco, USA, after World War II to replace the defunct League of Nations, and it brought together the different countries of the world. It was formed following the signing of the 1941 Atlantic Charter between President Franklin D. Roosevelt of USA and Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Britain. Its formation was concluded after three major conferences, namely the Yalta Conference, February 1945 in Crimea, Russia, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, October 1945 in Washington, D.C., USA, and the San Francisco Conference, October 1945 in USA. The big powers behind its formation were USA, Britain, France, Russia, and China. Initially, the UNO had 51 members and its headquarters were at New York, USA. Aims of the United Nations Organization, UNO. It was formed to maintain world peace and security in the post-World War II period through collective security. Therefore, it was formed to prevent the outbreak of another world war, to enforce disarmament and stop the manufacture of dangerous weapons, i.e. to prevent an arms race after World War II, to safeguard the world, especially the weaker nations, from military aggressors, to facilitate the decolonization of those countries that were still under foreign domination, to promote international cooperation after World War II, to find a way of bringing to justice those who committed crimes against humanity during World War II, like the Nazists and fascist war criminals who had conducted mass killing of the Jews, communists, and other innocent civilians, to promote economic development in the world, especially after World War II. It was to mobilize funds and help the third world countries to develop, to protect the environment against pollution and desertification, to fight against all forms of racial discrimination in the world, to eliminate international crimes like drug trafficking and the consumption of narcotic drugs, to rehabilitate and resettle the refugees who had been displaced and prisoners of war. That UNO was to provide them with food, water, shelter, and medical care. The organs of the United Nations Organization, UNO. The UNO had 6 principal or major organs to carry out its functions, and these included the General Assembly. This was the largest organ of the UNO. All member states of the UNO were members of the General Assembly. Each member state could send up to 5 representatives, but it was entitled to 1 vote in the Assembly. This ensured that all the members had equal status. The General Assembly met once a year, but special sessions would be held during times of crisis. At the beginning of every session, the Assembly would elect a new president. The General Assembly was responsible for discussing any matter affecting international peace and security, as well as making recommendations for peaceful settlement of disputes, among other functions. European history, the United Nations Organization, UNO 1945-1917. The Security Council. This was the most important and effective organ of the UNO, and it was the executive wing of the UNO. It therefore almost held all the real authority or powers. It consisted of 50 members, 5 of them permanent members, and these were Britain, China, France, Russia, and the USA. The non-permanent members were elected by the General Assembly for a term of 2 years. The permanent members had the power to veto or reject any of the decisions being taken by the Security Council. This means that even if the issue was being supported by a majority, it could not be implemented. It therefore implied that there had to be a consensus of all the 5 permanent members for a decision to be taken. The main responsibility of the Security Council was to maintain peace and security in the world. The Security Council met once a month, but in the event of an emergency, a meeting would be held to resolve the crisis. C. The International Court of Justice, ICJ. The International Court of Justice, ICJ, located in the city of Hague, Netherlands, was the principal judicial organ of the UNO. The court consisted of 15 judges from different countries elected by the General Assembly and the Security Council. They were elected for a 9-year term. This court was responsible for settling disputes brought to it by the member states, as well as providing legal advice to any organ of the UNO on request. T. The Trusteeship Council. The Trusteeship Council was set up immediately after World War II. It was set up to ensure the proper administration and development of those areas of the world that were under foreign rule, especially the mandated states. The Council was also to take steps to help them attain self-governance or independence. E. The Economic and Social Council. This was elected by the General Assembly for a 3-year term. This council gave proposals for solving international economic, social, cultural, educational and health problems. The council also tried tirelessly to wipe out poverty in the world. Its responsibility was to coordinate the functions of the specialized agencies of the UNO, like the International Monetary Fund (IMF), the International Labour Organization (ILO), the Food and Agricultural Organization (FAO), the World Health Organization (WHO), the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization (UNESCO), and the United Nations International Children's Emergence Fund (UNICEF), among others. F. The Secretariat. This was the principal administrative organ of the UNO that was charged with the responsibility of running the day-to-day activities of the UNO, like organizing conferences to solve international problems and giving information to the press on behalf of the UNO. It was headed by the Secretary General, who was appointed by the General Assembly on the recommendation of the Security. European history. The United Nations Organization UNO 1945-1970. It speeded up the decolonization process in the Third World countries, hence granting independence to most colonized countries. Many Third World countries in Africa, Asia and Latin America that were still under colonialism were supported financially and militarily in their struggles for independence by the UNO, especially through the Trusteeship Council. The UNO also condemned colonial rule and persuaded the colonial powers to grant independence to their colonies. As a result, many countries attained their independence by 1970, for example Ghana in 1957, Cameroon in 1960, Togo in 1960, as well as India and Pakistan in 1947, among others. It succeeded in the protection of the rights of the children through its specialized agencies. For example, it set up the United Nations International Children's Emergence Fund (UNICEF) in 1946, which helped to provide relief, health care and education to the children suffering as a result of disasters. It also went ahead to declare the rights of the children in 1959 as a step to guard against the mistreatment of the children in the world, which was an important achievement. It helped to maintain world peace and security to the extent that no major war on a world scale broke out between 1945 and 1970. Through the Security Council, the UNO attempted to resolve a number of international conflicts that broke out between 1945 and 1970. Among the major conflicts where the UNO intervened were the following. At the Berlin blockade incident of 1948-1949. This was an attempt by Russia to block all roads, railways and canal linking West Berlin and West Germany, which was under the Allied powers between 1948 and 1949. During the Potsdam Conference of 1945 that was held following the Allied victory over Germany on 8 May 1945. Berlin, the former capital of Germany, which lay in the Soviet Eastern Zone, was divided into 3 Western sectors and 1 Soviet sector, with the Western sectors later becoming West Berlin and the Soviet sector becoming East Berlin, the capital of East Germany. West Berlin was therefore completely surrounded by the East German territory, which was under Russian control. With that continuation of the Cold War, this division of Berlin increased the enmity between the Western powers and Russia. This forced Russia to create a blockade on the city of West Berlin. This blockade was aimed at preventing food and other supplies from arriving in West Berlin so as to force the Allied powers out of the city. This created scarcity of goods for the local population and the armed forces of the Western powers that were still stationed in West Berlin. The United Nations Organization, through the USA, Britain, France, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and several other countries, began a massive Berlin airlift supplying West Berlin with food and other necessities. This therefore forced Russia to abandon or lift the blockade in May 1949. Therefore, the UNO influenced the destruction of the Berlin blockade by 1949, which was a major achievement. The Kashmir crisis of 1948. After 1947, Kashmir, lying between the newly independent states of India and Pakistan, was claimed by both states. In 1948, war broke out between the two states. The UNO negotiated a ceasefire and India occupied southern Kashmir while Pakistan took over northern Kashmir. The UNO continued policing the border between the two countries. When Pakistan invaded the Indian zone later in 1965, a short war broke out between the two countries. However, once again the UNO successfully intervened and stopped the hostility. European history. The United Nations Organization UNO 1945-1917. The United Nations Security Council supported the defense of South Korea and therefore directed North Korea to withdraw its troops. When North Korea refused to do so, the United Nations Organization sent its troops to fight North Korea and stop the invasion. The result was that a peace agreement was signed and the hostilities between the two countries temporarily ended. T. The Suez Canal Crisis or War of 1956. In 1956, Egypt was invaded by Britain, France and Israel over the control of the Suez Canal in what came to be known as the Suez Canal Crisis or War. The United Nations General Assembly condemned the invasion and called for the withdrawal of the foreign troops, which was done, leading to the end of the crisis. It even sent troops to safeguard the Suez Canal. A Congo Crisis or Civil War of 1960-1963. The Republic of Congo dissolved into a civil war immediately after getting independence from Belgium in June 1960. This was due to the attempted breakaway from the rest of Congo Zaire by the diamond-rich Katanga province located in southeastern Congo. A United Nations force was sent to Congo which managed to defeat the secessionist forces in Katanga under Moise Tchouameni, restored law and order there by 1963. This therefore stopped the province of Katanga from breaking away from the rest of Congo. After the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, Cuba, located in Latin America or the Caribbean, was a communist country and therefore an ally of Russia. In October 1962, Russia sent nuclear missiles to Cuba to protect her from a planned invasion by capitalist USA, which was her neighbor. This move by the Russians threatened USA, which responded to the installation of the missiles by imposing a naval blockade on Cuba. This increased the enmity between USA and Russia and indeed brought the world closer to a nuclear war than ever before. The United Nations Security Council intervened in this Cuban Missile Crisis and forced Russia to remove the missiles from Cuba, which ended the crisis by November 1962. The Turkish-Greek Crisis or Civil War of 1963-1964. Cyprus, a British colony since the Berlin Congress of 1878, was granted independence in 1960. In 1963, a civil war broke out between the Greeks, who made up to 80% of this Mediterranean Sea island population, and the Turks. The United Nations peacekeeping force arrived in March 1964 and restored some peace in Cyprus. It promoted economic development in the member states. The UNO formed international economic agencies like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which extended or offered a lot of financial assistance to the underdeveloped or third world countries for economic development. This assistance greatly helped such countries to raise their levels of investment, especially after World War II. The UNO made efforts to protect the environment against degradation. Through the United Nations Environmental Programme and based in Nairobi, the UNO tried to combat environmental problems like desertification and pollution caused by industrialization, technological progress, and nuclear testing, among others. It also created awareness among governments on the dangers of European history. The United Nations Organization UNO 1945-1917. Development in the agricultural sector. This helped to increase food production among the member countries, thus leading to the attainment of food security in the world between 1945 and 1970. It improved on the welfare of the workers in the world. Through the International Labour Organization ILO, the UNO put in place labor laws and also labor conditions worldwide in terms of wages and retirement were looked into seriously by the UNO. The ILO also encouraged the formation of trade unions so as to protect the interests of the workers in the world. All these measures led to the improvement of the workers' conditions by the UNO. The UNO also succeeded in promoting cultural development in the world. The UNO established the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization UNESCO, which helped to promote education for all, press freedom and communication. The UNESCO also helped to protect the world's natural and cultural heritage sites in the world, which greatly helped to promote cultural development. The UNO attempted to check the problem of drug trafficking in the world. Before the formation of the UNO, there was rampant drug abuse and addiction that became a social evil. The members of UNO formed the Drug Trafficking Committee to monitor and frustrate the production, sale, transportation and consumption of intoxicating drugs such as opium, marijuana and cocaine. It also carried out sensitization programs among the member states on the dangers of consuming drugs. By 1970, these measures had drastically reduced the production, sale and consumption of toxic drugs. This restored peace, order and made the world a better place to live in. The UNO promoted health conditions in the world between 1945 and 1970. Through the World Health Organization (WHO), the UNO carried out immunization programs among the member states which helped to fight against epidemic diseases like smallpox, sleeping sickness, measles, tetanus, polio and malaria, among others. The UNO also financed the building and renovation of health centers in the member states, which helped to improve the health conditions in the world up to 1970. The UNO also tried to solve the refugee problem after World War II. During the course of World War II, many people were displaced from their homes and they became refugees. For example, the many Jews and other people fled Germany and Italy to avoid persecution and massive killing. In the post-World War II period, therefore, there was a problem of transferring these people to their individual countries. Consequently, the UNO formed specialized agencies like the United Nations High Commission for Refugees UNHCR and the United Nations Refugee and Work Agency UNRWA, through which it succeeded in giving relief assistance as well as resettling these displaced persons. After World War II, these agencies also helped areas that were affected by wars in the world up to 1970 as a step to deal with the refugee problem. The UNO also encouraged the trial and punishment of those people who had committed crimes against humanity during the course of World War II. For example, through the International Court of Justice (ICJ) that was based in the city of Hague in the Netherlands, the UNO tried the Nazist and fascist war criminals who had conducted mass killing of the Jews, communists and other innocent civilians during the course of World War II. This helped to bring about justice in the world. The UNO campaigned against cultural and racial discrimination in the world. For example, it secured European history, the United Nations Organization UNO 1945 and as 1970. It established the Jewish State of Israel in 1948, which was another achievement. During the course of World War II, many Jews were massacred by the Nazis under Adolf Hitler. As a result, after the war, the UNO created the State of Israel in the Middle East to accommodate all those Jews who had been scattered all over Europe. This helped to end the persecution of the Jews and for that matter. Therefore, the UNO was successful in the protection of the minorities like the Jews. The UNO encouraged the disarmament process, which helped to regulate the production and use of the weapons of mass destruction after World War II. For example, it established the Atomic Energy Commission in 1946, and this greatly helped to check on the production of dangerous weapons. It also influenced the signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 by the member states. It also initiated disarmament negotiations or talks between USA and USSR, the Cold War superpowers, aimed at reducing the manufacture of dangerous weapons after World War II. These bilateral talks came to be known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. The negotiations commenced in Helsinki in Finland in November 1969 and resulted into the signing of international treaties involving two superpowers, i.e. SALT I of 26 May 1972 and SALT Roman II of 18 June 1974. The failures of the United Nations Organization, 1945-1917. The UNO failed to end cultural intolerance and racism in the whole world. When the UNO was established in 1945, it declared racism as a crime against humanity, and therefore it worked hard to eliminate this bad practice, including imposing economic sanctions against racist regimes in the world. Despite this, however, racism and discrimination continued to exist in the world up to 1970. For example, there was apartheid in South Africa by 1970, despite the anti-apartheid campaigns that were carried out against the apartheid regime in South Africa. Racial segregation also increased in the Middle East and America between 1945 and 1970, which undermined the credibility of the UNO. The UNO failed to eliminate or stop the Cold War. This was a state of global affairs characterized by tension, fear, suspicion, military skirmishes and conflicts between the Eastern or Communist bloc led by USSR and the Western or capitalist bloc led by USA. It emerged after the end of World War II, when USA and USSR emerged as superpowers with divergent political and economic ideologies, dividing the world into two hostile camps. The UNO was not able to convince the two superpowers of USSR and USA to give up this conflict, which threatened international peace between 1945 and 1970. The UNO failed to disarm the big powers of the world. Both USA and USSR, together with Britain, China and France, continued manufacturing and testing atomic or nuclear weapons despite the banning by the UNO. This eventually led to the spread of the weapons of mass destruction to the third world countries. Therefore, the development and spread of nuclear weapons continued up to 1970, which was a big failure. It failed to wipe out or end drug and human trafficking, which were major problems before and after World War II and were indeed crimes against humanity. Worse still, these activities were carried out by some member countries of the UNO. The UNO failed to complete the decolonization process by 1970. Many third world countries remained under the yoke influence of colonial rule, especially in Africa like Angola, Mozambique, Namibia and Guinea-Bissau among others by 1970. Therefore, the UNO failed to enforce total European history. The United Nations Organization, 1945-1917. Example, there were widespread civil wars in Africa like Congo crisis or Civil War of 1906-1963, the Sudan Civil War since 1955, and the Nigerian or Biafran Civil War of 1967-1970. Other conflicts included the Suez Canal Crisis War of 1956, the Hungarian Crisis or Revolution of 1956, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, as well as the Korean War of 1953-1955, that was between North and South Korea. All these conflicts that threatened world peace, yet this was one of the major objectives behind the formation of the UNO in 1945. The UNO failed to promote economic development in the world, despite the enormous financial aid that was offered to the member states by the UNO through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The socio-economic welfare of most people in the world remained poor by 1970. For example, many people worldwide, especially in the third world countries, lived below the poverty line, and also the refugee problem persisted by 1970. Therefore, the UNO was not successful as regards economic development. The UNO failed to solve conflicts in the world by 1970. For example, there was the Kashmir conflict between India and Pakistan, as well as the North-South Korean conflict, which continued to create tension on the Korean peninsula up to 1970. In addition, the Arab-Israel or Palestinian conflict in the Middle East was not resolved by the UNO due to the ineffective or weak economic sanctions imposed by the UNO on Israel. These conflicts further threatened world peace between 1945 and 1970, thus a major failure by the UNO as regards matters concerning world peace and security. The UNO also failed to eradicate tendencies of terrorism or violence in the world. International terrorism became a major problem in the post-World War II period due to the Cold War rivalry between the Western or capitalist and the Eastern or communist blocs, as each of the two hostile camps sponsored terrorist activities against each other like suicide bombings, hijacking of ships and planes, as well as assassination of prominent leaders. This also threatened international peace up to 1970. The UNO failed to create an army of its own. Due to their ideological differences, the UN member states failed to establish a joint army that was necessary to maintain world peace after 1945. Because of this, therefore, the UNO lacked a permanent army of its own to enforce its resolutions, especially in the face of global conflicts that broke out in the period 1945 to 1970. This is perhaps why the UNO failed to resolve international conflicts like the Arab-Israel conflict, the Kashmir crisis, as well as the Korean conflict up to 1970. It failed to stop the emergence of neo-colonialism or foreign influence in the newly independent countries of the third world regions like Africa. As a result, there was foreign aid being given to the developing countries by the United Nations economic agencies like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund with strings attached or in non-priority areas. This, therefore, undermined their political, social and economic independence, yet one of the objectives behind the formation of the UNO was to promote the self-determination and decolonization of all those countries that were still under foreign domination by 1945. Questions. To what extent did the United Nations Organization UNO live up to the expectations of its European history? The United Nations Organization UNO 1945-1970. The strengths of the United Nations Organization UNO. The UNO had a wider membership. Formed in 1945 with only 51 members, by 1970 the membership of the UNO had increased to about 150 members. This was a major strength that enabled the organization to achieve most of the objectives of its founders. The membership of the two world superpowers in the UNO was strength. Both USA and USSR, the key world superpowers of the time, were full and permanent members of all the UN agencies, including the Security Council. These were powerful states with huge financial, human and military resources, which strengthened the UNO and therefore enabled it to deal with the challenges of the time, hence achieving the objectives of its founders. Its earlier successes earned it approval and respect in the world as a viable international organization that would address the global challenges of the time. This partly explains why many countries joined the UNO after 1945, which strengthened it, hence enabling it to achieve the objectives of its founders by 1970. The prevention of a series of wars between Israel and the Arab states was strength of the UNO. After World War II, the Middle East was plunged into instability following the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel in 1948 on Arab land. This resulted into a series of wars between Israel and her Arab neighbors like Syria, Jordan, and Egypt in 1948, 1949, 1956, as well as 1967. In all these wars, the UNO intervened and restored some peace and order in the region. The UNO had various specialized agencies to handle the different challenges of the time. These included the International Labour Organization (ILO), the World Health Organization (WHO), the Food and Agricultural Organization (FAO), the United Nations International Children's Emergence Fund (UNICEF), and the United Nations High Commission for Refugees (UNHCR), among others. Through these various agencies, the UNO offered a lot of social and economic support to the world nations, which helped to deal with many problems of the time up to 1970. The disarmament policy of the UNO was strength. Through this policy, the UNO encouraged the disarmament process in the post-World War Roman II period, which helped to avert the outbreak of a Third World War. For example, it encouraged the member states to sign the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. It also established the Atomic Energy Commission in 1946, which helped to check on the production of dangerous weapons. It also arranged disarmament talks from 1969 between USA and USSR to reduce the manufacture of dangerous weapons after World War II. These bilateral talks came to be known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks (SALT). This disarmament policy enabled the UNO to achieve its objective of maintaining world peace up to 1970. The UNO had a strong administrative structure which enabled it to achieve its objectives. When the UNO was set up in 1945, it inherited some of the administrative organs of the League of Nations and even went ahead to establish new ones. These were the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Secretariat, the Trusteeship Council, the Economic and Social Council, as well as the International Court of Justice. These organs and committees facilitated the implementation of the United Nations resolutions up to 1970. The UNO also had clear guiding principles based on the UN Charter of 1945, which all member countries signed. For example, there was the principle of non-interference in the internal European history, the United Nations Organization (UNO) 1945-1970. The veto powers of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council enhanced joint decision-making. The Security Council of the UNO was made up of 5 permanent members, and these were basically World War II victorious powers, which included USA, USSR, Britain, France, and China. Each of these permanent members had the power to veto or reject the Council's decision, and therefore stop it from being implemented even if all the other members agreed. This therefore encouraged joint decision-making by the UNO, which was a major strength of the organization. The UNO had the capacity to mobilize a peacekeeping force in case of need, and this was another sign of strength. Whenever a dispute broke out, the UNO mobilized a joint force that intervened and restored peace in such areas. For example, when the Congo crisis broke out in June 1960 following the declaration of Katanga's independence from the rest of Congo, the UNO quickly mobilized troops from member countries like Nigeria, Ghana, India, and Sweden. These troops later launched military operations against Moise Tcham's forces in the Katanga region using modern weapons. This weakened greatly Moise Tcham and his forces, thus contributing to the failure of the secession by 1963. The weaknesses of the United Nations Organization (UNO). Despite its much strength, the UNO also had a number of weaknesses which made it hard to achieve its objectives by 1970, and these included the following. The organization lacked a permanent army to its own by 1970. This made it difficult for it to enforce its resolutions. For example, the Israel-Arab 6 Days of 1967, when the member states withdrew their forces from the Egyptian border with Israel, the conflict escalated. The ideological differences and internal divisions, especially among the Security Council members or big powers, always deterred the success of the United Nations organization. For example, it was ideologically divided between the capitalist states led by USA and the communist countries led by USSR and China. This is perhaps why they failed to form a permanent force as well as to enforce the international law. The domination of the UNO by the USA and USSR promoted suspicion and mistrust from the other members, which deterred the organization from achieving its objectives. The organization embraced the formation of regional security organizations like the NATO to which some member countries paid more allegiance than the UNO. It lacked a strong financial base. The UNO largely depended on financial contributions from member countries to finance its operations, but which contributions were regular. This limited or deterred the implementation of its activities. The organization gave the permanent members of the Security Council veto powers, but these powers were many times abused or misused by the members to frustrate the implementation of the UNO resolution. This affected decision-making in the United Nations organization, thus deterring its success. The existence of alliances within the United Nations members was a major weakness. A number of military alliances were formed by the different UN member states in the post-World War II period. These alliances were a result of the Cold War tension and suspicion between the Eastern Bloc led by USSR and the Western Bloc led by USA that emerged after the end of World War II. 4. European history. The United Nations Organization UNO 1945-1917. Countries in the North Atlantic region led by USA as well as the Warsaw Pact formed in 1955 by the communist countries led by USSR. The existence of these greatly affected decision by the UNO. The timing of its involvement in the areas of dispute was not clear. As a peacekeeping body, the UNO was expected to take immediate action whenever a crisis broke out, but sometimes it delayed to intervene, which escalated such conflicts up to the extent of threatening international peace. For example, it took long to intervene in the Congo crisis or civil war of 1960-1963 as well as the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. It also hesitantly or reluctantly handled the Middle East crisis since 1948. Therefore, the UNO was always reluctant to take decisions or took long to implement her decisions. The organization was racist and isolated the Third World states. It was largely dominated by the developed countries of the world, which always dominated the discussions in the UNO. This alienated the organization from the Third World states, yet they were the majority in the world. It lacked the personnel or manpower to handle most of the challenges that confronted the organization. This deterred the UNO from implementing its decisions. The UNO disarmament policy was weak and selective. The major world powers like USA, USSR and China continued manufacturing weapons of mass destruction in the post-World War II period as UN just looked on, yet the small countries were always discouraged from doing so. The UNO lacked effective penalties to deal with those countries which violated its objectives. For example, it played double standards in the decolonization process of Africa, where it imposed weak economic sanctions of the colonial regimes like the apartheid regime in South Africa. These sanctions were ineffective and therefore explain why such African countries took long to be liberated from colonial domination. The UNO extended financial aid to the world nations through its financial agencies like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank as a step to promote economic development. However, this financial aid was always selective and with conditions attached, which was a weakness, and therefore could not end poverty in the world. The member states even went ahead and set up the Economic and Social Council of the UNO, but this council also had no financial footing to alleviate poverty from the Third World states. The International Court of Justice, which was the judicial arm of the UNO based in the city of Hague in Netherlands, was always determined by the whites only, and its decisions were always selective because they favoured the major powers. This also made the UNO unable to fulfill its objectives. The UNO lacked facilities to effect its decisions and roles. For example, it did not have jets, ships, and even vehicles of its own to carry out peace operations in the world. This explains why it was always reluctant to intervene in areas of conflict. I examined the strengths and weaknesses of the United Nations Organization UNO by 1970. Challenges faced by the United Nations Organization UNO between 1945 and 1970. The aims and objectives of the UNO are part and parcel of the challenges, and these were to maintain international peace and security, to check the rise of aggressive leaders. European history. The United Nations Organization UNO 1945-1917. To ensure equal rights to self-determination of all member states and nations, to promote international diplomacy. Its leadership involved in international controversies, promotion of better health conditions, to punish the war criminals such as the Nazis and fascists, rehabilitation of the war-torn countries Japan, Germany, Italy, promote economic cooperations, promote children's rights and emancipation of women, to address refugee crisis, to combat environmental threats, enforcing disarmament in the face of the Cold War, democratization and decolonization especially in the Third World countries, limited number of permanent members of the Security Council which were only 5 denied, the UNO more financial and military resources. The Cold War undermined the performance of the UNO because it increased international conflict. Differences in ideology between communist USSR and capitalist USA. International tension and crises like the Congo crisis of 1960-1963, the Suez Canal crisis of 1956, the Hungarian crisis of 1956 and the Korean crisis of 1953-1955 overstretched the resources of the UNO. The presence of local or regional organizations which had conflicting aims like NATO, Warsaw-backed, Tito, Baghdad-backed, widespread civil wars in Africa, Asia and Latin America, increased racial segregation in the Middle East, South Africa and the America, the continued human and drug trafficking among the member states, continued Israeli aggression against the Palestinians, leading to instability in the Middle East from 1948 to 1970 without viable solutions, the increased tendencies of terrorism in the world characterized by the hijacking of planes, suicide bombings and assassinations, increased instability in the world which undermined the performance of the UNO. European history. The United Nations Organization, UNO, 1945-1970.